Maya Reynolds slumped into her window seat in row 13, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The last 14 hours in the Chicago ER had been brutal, a mix of car accident victims, overdoses, and a frantic code blue that had left her heart racing and her palms shaking. She barely noticed the hum of the plane's engines as she fastened her seatbelt, pulling her hoodie tighter around herself. Around her, the cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight energy. Bobbies cried, couples whispered, and the smell of reheated coffee drifted from the galley. Her eyes flicked across the rows. A businessman was tapping furiously at his laptop. A teenage boy scrolled through his phone with earbuds jammed in his ears. She saw an elderly woman adjust her scarf nervously, and a young couple in the aisle seats murmuring about their vacation plans. Even from her corner, Maya could feel the collective tension of a full flight, everyone carrying their own stories, their own little dramas, none of them aware of the potential danger looming above. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, but Maya barely registered the movements of the oxygen masks or the life vest instructions. Her mind was still stuck in the trauma of the ER, reliving every high-stakes decision she'd made that day. She rubbed her eyes, leaning her head against the cool window, trying to shut out everything, to drift into a rare few hours of unconsciousness. The captain's voice suddenly came over the intercom, calm but unusually serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We may have a situation. Is anyone here a pilot?" The cabin went silent. Phones paused mid-swipe. Conversations died in the air. A heavy tension settled over the passengers like a sudden storm. Maya's eyes snapped open, heart hammering. She could feel the gaze of everyone around her, their confusion and fear pressing into her chest. Nobody moved. Nobody answered. A young flight attendant, barely out of college, whispered to her colleague, "Did he really just ask if anyone's a pilot?" The other attendant shook her head, biting her lip, eyes wide. Panic was beginning to ripple through the cabin. People glanced at each other, uncertain, clutching bags, children, and arms tightly. Maya felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Something was wrong. The man in the aisle seat next to her, a large man in a tailored suit, looked around as if expecting someone to jump up and save them. "Surely there's a pilot on board," he muttered, his voice quivering, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. Nobody seemed to know what to do. The cabin lights flickered momentarily as the plane lurched gently and a few passengers gasped, clutching the armrests. Maya's own hands shook slightly. Her throat tightened. She considered ignoring it, closing her eyes, pretending it was just a routine announcement. But instinct prickled at her nerves. She had been trained for emergencies, for moments like this, though not in the cramped chaos of a commercial aircraft. Her military flight training felt like a distant memory, tucked behind layers of civilian life, long shifts, and hospital protocols. But now the call was real, immediate, impossible to ignore. Her mind raced. Can I really do this? She hadn't piloted a commercial jet since leaving the Air Force. Her experience was in military aircraft, not this metal tube crammed with strangers. But as she glanced down the aisle, seeing the faces of fear, anxiety, and helplessness, a deep sense of duty surged. She could not sit here and do nothing while the captain's voice trembled ever so slightly over the intercom. Someone had to respond. A baby cried somewhere in the middle of the cabin. A man muttered a prayer under his breath. The faint scent of fear mingled with recycled cabin air. Maya's heart hammered so loudly it felt like it echoed in the fuselage. She raised her hand slowly, hesitantly, almost afraid to make the move. Murmurs swept through the rows as passengers noticed her. Eyes widened, whispers started, and a collective weight seemed to lift off the air. I'm a pilot," she said, her voice soft but steady. A brief, startled silence followed, as though the cabin was holding its breath. Then the captain's voice crackled through again. "Thank God. Report to the cockpit immediately. We need you." Maya's stomach dropped. The reality of what she had just committed to struck her like a punch. She wasn't just volunteering. She was stepping into a situation where lives hung by a thread, where every second mattered, and where panic could easily tip the balance toward disaster. She slid her bag under the seat, took a deep breath, and began navigating the narrow aisle. Passengers stepped aside, some whispering frantic encouragement, others frozen in stunned silence. Each step felt heavier than the last. She passed a young couple gripping hands, their faces pale and tight with worry. A teenage boy peeked up from his phone, his mouth open in awe. An older woman whispered a quiet "God bless you" as she moved past. Maya's own mind was a storm of calculations, memories, and adrenaline. This is it. This is real. Don't let fear win. As she reached the cockpit door, her hand hovered over the latch. She paused, closing her eyes for a brief moment, trying to summon the calm she had always needed in emergencies. Her military training came back in fragments: control, focus, situational awareness. She inhaled deeply, feeling the tremor in her hand steady, at least enough to turn the handle. The door slid open, and the scene inside nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. The co-pilot, young and visibly terrified, gripped the controls as the captain glanced at the screens, his jaw tight. Warning lights flashed, casting eerie red glows across the small cockpit. The engines hummed differently, almost threateningly, vibrating through the metal frame beneath her feet. Every instinct screamed danger. "Thank God you're here," the captain said, his voice a mixture of relief and strain. "We lost autopilot control. We can't stabilize the plane." Maya's hands instinctively moved toward the controls. Sweat pricked her forehead. The plane shuddered violently, rocking them in their harnesses. Panic threatened to rise, but she pushed it down, forcing herself to focus. This wasn't a dream, it wasn't a drill, and it wasn't optional. Lives were literally in her hands. She glanced back at the intercom button, imagining the terrified faces of the passengers, each one frozen in their seat, some clutching loved ones, some silently praying. She knew the next moves would define the line between life and catastrophe. Her heart pounded, adrenaline surged, and the weight of responsibility settled fully on her shoulders. The cockpit was suddenly quiet, aside from the low hum of engines and the occasional beeping of alarms. Maya's eyes flicked across the control panels, scanning switches, instruments, and warning lights. Every calculation she had learned in the past felt both distant and urgent. The plane lurched again, a sharp reminder of how fragile their situation truly was. One wrong move and everyone dies. Her stomach twisted, her hands steadied, and she realized there was no turning back. The first steps of an impossible journey were already underway. The plane continued its flight, passengers oblivious to the precise moment when the lives in their hands had shifted entirely to a woman in row 13, whose eyes were now wide open and fully aware. Maya had just crossed the line from ordinary passenger to the only hope aboard this flight. And in that suspended electric silence, every heartbeat in the cabin seemed to count. The moment Maya left her seat, the cabin erupted in whispers, anxious murmurs, and sudden shuffling. Phones were held up, some passengers recording, some searching frantically for news or reassurance. The man in the aisle seat near her muttered, "This can't be real, someone must be joking." His hand shook as he gripped the armrest. Across the aisle, a young mother clutched her daughter, stroking her hair while whispering prayers under her breath. The quiet hum of the engines felt alien, like it belonged to someone else's life, someone safe. Maya's mind raced even as her legs carried her down the narrow aisle. Memories of flight simulators, military training, and split-second decision-making flashed like strobe lights in her head. This was no longer about exams, exercises, or protocol. This was a plane full of civilians who didn't know how close they were to disaster. She passed rows of wide-eyed passengers, some frozen, some trying to mask panic behind forced smiles, some openly praying, crying, or muttering frantic encouragements to strangers. An older woman in a red scarf reached out as Maya passed. "Please get us out of this," she whispered. Maya nodded, swallowing hard, heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't even reached the cockpit yet, and already the weight of responsibility pressed down like a physical force. Somewhere in the middle of the cabin, a teenage boy let out a low, shaky whistle. He glanced at his friends. Did she just say she's a pilot? One nodded, eyes wide. The reality hit them all at once. The flight's fate rested in the hands of a stranger who was just a passenger minutes ago. Meanwhile, the flight attendants attempted to manage the panic, moving down the aisles with strained smiles. "Please remain calm. Everything under control," one urged, though her voice trembled. Maya could see their hands shaking slightly, clenching the edges of seats and service carts. Their calm was paper-thin, held together by professionalism rather than certainty. She realized that no one here had ever faced a situation like this in real life. The man next to her, tall in a tailored navy suit, finally spoke aloud. She's actually going to do it," he said. "Someone has to." His voice was a mixture of fear and awe. Another passenger, a woman in her 30s, whispered fiercely, "I hope she knows what she's doing." Maya felt the weight of their gazes, their collective hope and desperation, pressing down on her like a physical force. Her own chest tightened. The training she had buried beneath years of civilian life surged back, a lifeline in a sea of panic. She repeated her mental checklist: locate cockpit, assess situation, stabilize controls, communicate with crew. Every fiber of her being was aware that there was no margin for error. She felt a shiver of fear, not the fear of flying, but the fear of responsibility, of being the only person capable of averting catastrophe. Finally, she reached the cockpit door. The co-pilot looked up, pale and sweat-soaked, hands gripping the controls like a lifeline. His eyes widened as he registered her presence. "Thank God," he whispered. The captain, middle-aged with streaks of gray in his hair, looked equally relieved but tense. Warning lights flickered on the panel, red and orange, casting an ominous glow across the cockpit. The hum of the engines felt menacing, vibrating through Maya's bones. "Autopilot's gone," the co-pilot said, voice tight with fear. "We can't stabilize it. I have never seen anything like this." Maya swallowed, the familiar adrenaline of crisis snapping her into focus. Every instinct she had trained for kicked in. She began scanning the controls, trying to remember the procedures, recalling the simulators, the drills, the endless hours spent learning how to respond to emergencies. This was real now, and mistakes had consequences measured in lives, not test scores. Back in the cabin, chaos intensified. A man near the emergency exit pushed his glasses up nervously, muttering, "We could all die." Another passenger, a woman clutching her infant, whispered prayers she barely remembered from childhood. Across the aisle, a young couple held hands, knuckles white, staring straight ahead with terrified eyes. The hum of the plane seemed to swell, almost predatory, as though the aircraft itself sensed the tension. A sudden jolt made the entire cabin lurch. Drinks spilled, bags slid from overhead bins, and some passengers screamed. Maya felt it in the cockpit too, a violent tilt that knocked the co-pilot sideways. "Hold it steady," she shouted, grabbing the nearest controls instinctively. Her hands moved with precision, her mind calculating altitude, thrust, and wind patterns faster than she could consciously process. Every second stretched into eternity. The captain glanced at her with a mixture of relief and caution. "Can you stabilize it?" he asked. Maya swallowed, heart pounding. "I'll try," she said firmly. She didn't have the luxury of doubt. The plane shuddered again. Outside, clouds churned like stormy seas, and flashes of lightning illuminated the sky, making the aircraft appear small and vulnerable. Down below, the city lights flickered in the distance, oblivious to the unfolding crisis above. Maya could hear the faint murmur of passengers, now quieter, as if the gravity of the situation had forced them into silence. Fear was a tangible thing, filling the cabin like smoke. She could sense it, feel it pressing against her as she worked, her eyes scanning gauges and instruments, calculating the exact combination of movements needed to keep the plane level. A warning beep sounded, hydraulic systems failing. Maya's stomach lurched. Her hands moved faster, recalling emergency protocols, flipping switches, adjusting rudder controls, carefully balancing the tilt of the plane. Sweat drenched her forehead. The co-pilot's hands shook as he followed her lead. The captain issued concise instructions, monitoring readings, voice calm but tense. "Steady. Keep it steady." In the cabin, a young boy whispered, "Mom, are we going to die?" His mother hugged him tighter, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. An elderly man clasped his wife's hand, both trembling. Across the aisle, a woman's eyes were squeezed shut as she muttered, "Please, God." The panic and hope were intertwined, a fragile web hanging over the aircraft, waiting for someone to untangle it. Maya could feel the weight of each life pressing on her shoulders. Every adjustment she made was a balance between physics and intuition, training and instinct. One wrong move could send the plane spiraling into chaos. She pushed fear aside, locking her focus entirely on the instruments, the controls, and the unknown dangers that lay ahead. Each jolt of turbulence felt like the plane testing her, daring her to fail. Time became elastic. Seconds stretched, compressed, and warped as she worked alongside the co-pilot, issuing commands, correcting tilts, stabilizing speed. She ignored the alarms that screamed around her, focusing only on the delicate dance that kept the plane airborne. Outside the cockpit window, the clouds churned violently, a swirling maelstrom of gray and black. Lightning split the sky, casting grotesque shadows across the instruments and their faces. Then came a strange, grinding vibration from the left engine. The co-pilot froze, eyes wide. "Left engine instability," he whispered. Maya's stomach dropped. This wasn't just autopilot failure. Something mechanical had gone wrong, something she had to correct immediately. Her hands flew across the controls, adjusting throttle, flaps, and rudder with a precision born of years of training. The plane shuddered again, violently this time, and she gritted her teeth, refusing to let panic take over. Somewhere below, the city lights beckoned like a lifeline, a distant promise of safety. She inhaled sharply, trying to calm her racing heart. The co-pilot followed her lead, mimicking her adjustments, trembling but trusting her instincts. The captain's voice remained calm, guiding and monitoring, but the tension was electric, filling every inch of the cockpit and through the intercom, every inch of the cabin. Back in row 13, Maya's empty seat seemed symbolic, a fleeting moment of normalcy ripped away by crisis. Passengers shifted nervously, some clutching loved ones, some silently praying, all aware that the life of the plane now rested in the hands of one woman. Maya's decision to step forward had transformed her from exhausted traveler to the sole hope for survival. As the plane stabilized marginally, the hum of the engines became a tense backdrop to the collective fear in the cabin. Maya allowed herself a brief glance at the co-pilot. He gave a shaky nod. Together, they had bought a small measure of control, but they both knew the crisis was far from over. Outside, storm clouds raged, warning lights still blinked, and the plane continued its precarious dance in the night sky. And the question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Would she be able to bring them safely through this storm? Or was this only the beginning of an even greater test? The cockpit was a storm of alarms, warning lights, and tension. Maya's hands moved almost automatically across the controls, her mind racing through procedures she hadn't used in years. The autopilot had failed, and now the plane depended entirely on human skill, a skill she hadn't applied outside military jets. She took a deep breath, feeling the vibration of the engines reverberate through her bones. One wrong move, one hesitation, and hundreds of lives could be lost. "Check the instruments," she instructed the co-pilot, her voice firm despite the adrenaline pounding in her chest. His hands shook as he fumbled with the panels, eyes darting between her and the flashing gauges. "Hydraulic systems are fluctuating. Left engine instability," he reported, voice tight. Maya's stomach twisted. She had expected a routine emergency, but the combination of failures made this far worse than any simulation. "Okay," she said, forcing herself to calm down. "We'll take it step by step. I need you to monitor the instruments. I'll handle the controls. Keep the wings level, focus on altitude, not speed yet." She could feel the sweat pooling at her temples, her uniform sticking to her skin, but she forced herself to concentrate. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Every second counted. The plane lurched violently, pitching to the left. Maya's hands gripped the yoke as she countered the tilt, shouting instructions. "Hold it, steady, steady." Outside, lightning illuminated the sky, showing clouds swirling like an angry ocean. The co-pilot's knuckles were white as he followed her commands, and the captain watched silently, monitoring the screens. Time stretched as Maya balanced the plane, aware that every adjustment might trigger another cascade of failures. She glanced at the instruments again. The left engine was sputtering under the strain, threatening further instability. Hydraulic pressure fluctuated wildly, the warnings blinking red like a heartbeat. Maya's mind raced, flipping through everything she had learned about aircraft control, engine management, and emergency procedures. This was no longer about flying. It was about improvisation, about thinking faster than the machine itself. The co-pilot swallowed hard. Do we need to declare an emergency?" he asked, voice trembling. Maya shook her head sharply. "We focus first. If we panic now, it'll make things worse. We stabilize first, then we communicate." She glanced back at the cockpit door, imagining the passengers in the cabin. Their eyes, full of fear, were waiting for someone to lead them out of chaos. The weight of their trust pressed down on her, heavier than any plane she had ever flown. A violent shudder ran through the plane as turbulence struck. Maya gritted her teeth, adjusting the throttle and yoke, countering each tilt with precise corrections. The engines groaned, warning lights flashing faster. She could hear the faint cries and whispers over the intercom, the tension in the cabin palpable even through the cockpit doors. Somewhere behind her, the young co-pilot muttered a prayer under his breath. "Altitude, watch altitude," Maya barked. "Do not let it drop suddenly." She quickly assessed the instruments. The plane was at 33,000 feet, and sudden turbulence could send it plummeting. She adjusted the stabilizers, calculated the safest descent path, and coordinated with the co-pilot. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and executed under the crushing pressure of life-or-death stakes. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the cockpit, revealing the young co-pilot's fear-stricken face. I've never seen anything like this," he admitted, voice tight. Maya's jaw clenched. "Then don't. Follow my lead." Her fingers danced over switches, flipping flaps and throttles, stabilizing the plane just enough to counter the turbulence. The engines groaned again, but the plane held. The captain finally spoke, voice calm but tense. "We need to communicate with air traffic control. We don't know if we can reach the airport safely." Maya nodded. "Go ahead, keep them informed. We're still stabilizing." The co-pilot keyed the radio, announcing a partial emergency, while Maya continued to adjust the plane's controls. Every second was a battle against gravity, turbulence, and mechanical failure. She took a brief glance at the radar. Storm cells were ahead, violent and unpredictable, but there was a narrow corridor for a potential landing. She plotted a course, her mind racing through wind patterns, altitude, and engine performance. The plane shuddered violently again, forcing her to correct the tilt with rapid, precise movements. The co-pilot's hands were trembling, but he mirrored her actions as best he could. "Hold it steady, steady," Maya muttered, almost to herself, almost hypnotically. The plane responded, if only slightly, stabilizing enough to buy them a few precious seconds. Her eyes flicked to the warning lights again. Fluctuating hydraulics, engine strain, flaps partially unresponsive. Each failure was like a ticking bomb, but she refused to let panic dictate her actions. She focused on one thing at a time, prioritizing survival. Back in the cabin, tension mounted. Passengers whispered, some prayed aloud, some clutched hands or phones. The faint murmur of fear traveled up the aisles like an invisible current. The man in the Navy suit muttered, "She's doing it, she's actually keeping us alive." A mother held her daughter close, whispering, "Mommy's got this," as if speaking to herself as well. Every passenger now relied entirely on Maya's expertise, their fate tethered to her hands. Lightning cracked overhead again, illuminating the dark clouds around them. Maya's pulse raced, but her focus never wavered. She adjusted the yoke to counter a sudden roll, calculated engine thrust, and monitored the hydraulic system. She had learned long ago that fear was the enemy of precision. Every correction she made was executed with meticulous care. One miscalculation and it would all unravel. The co-pilot swallowed hard. "We were holding," he whispered. "For now." Maya allowed herself a fraction of relief, but the weight of responsibility was relentless. The plane was far from safe, but they had bought themselves time she would use to navigate through the storm, through mechanical failures, and through the unknown dangers that still loomed ahead. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to slow her heartbeat, to calm the adrenaline surging through her veins. The cockpit felt like a crucible, testing every skill, every instinct she had ever learned. And though her body shook with tension, her mind was razor-sharp, focused entirely on survival. "Keep your eyes on the instruments," she said firmly. "We're going to get through this, step by step, adjustment by adjustment. No panic." The co-pilot nodded, sweat streaming down his forehead, and followed her commands. The captain monitored quietly, trusting her judgment. Outside, the storm churned, a swirling vortex of clouds and lightning. Inside, every hand in the cockpit moved with precision, every decision a delicate balance. Maya realized the plane wasn't just a machine. It was an extension of their combined focus, of her determination, of their will to survive. Somehow, against all odds, she had taken control. But the storm outside and the hidden failures within the plane meant that the worst was not yet over. The cabin remained tense, passengers unaware that their lives were hanging by the skill of a woman who had been sleeping in row 13 just minutes ago. Maya's fingers hovered over the yoke, ready for the next jolt, the next crisis. She could feel the co-pilot's eyes on her, the captain's quiet monitoring, and the weight of hundreds of lives pressing down. One wrong move now, and it would all end in disaster. And then another alarm blared. Something else was wrong, something she hadn't anticipated. The cockpit was a furnace of tension. Warning lights blinked red and amber, alarms shrilled, and the engines vibrated with a deep, threatening hum. Maya's hands moved with precision, her fingers flying over switches and throttles she hadn't touched in years. Every decision was a split-second calculation, every movement a gamble. She could feel the weight of the plane pressing against her shoulders, of hundreds of lives riding on her skill. There was no room for hesitation. The co-pilot's voice was tight with fear. "Left engine pressure is dropping. Hydraulics are fluctuating. I don't know if we can." Maya cut him off with a firm shake of her head. "We can. We will. Focus. I need you to monitor the instruments and follow my instructions exactly. No improvisation, just precision." His hands trembled, but he nodded, eyes glued to the panels. The plane shuddered violently, pitching to the left. Maya countered instinctively, twisting the yoke, adjusting the throttle, and balancing the rudders. Lightning split the clouds outside the cockpit windows, illuminating the swirling storm like a hellish scene from a nightmare. The engines groaned, and Maya could feel the aircraft straining under its own weight. A bead of sweat ran down her temple as she barked instructions over her shoulder. "Stabilize. Hold altitude. Flaps 20 degrees now." The captain remained calm, but his gaze was sharp, scanning the instruments, ready to intervene if needed. "We're losing airspeed," he said quietly. "Keep it steady." Maya nodded, adjusting the throttles, eyes darting between the altimeter, speed indicators, and engine pressure gauges. The plane responded sluggishly, teetering on the edge of control. She clenched her jaw, willing the aircraft to obey her commands. Suddenly, the plane lurched again, violently this time. The co-pilot's knuckles were white as he gripped the yoke. She's keeping it, sort of," he muttered, voice tight. Maya didn't have time to respond. She was fully immersed in the impossible task of balancing multiple failing systems while preparing for the unknown that waited ahead. Each jolt was a test, each shudder a reminder that perfection was their only path to survival. "Check the hydraulic systems again," Maya commanded. She flipped a series of switches and monitored the readings. Pressure stabilized marginally, but the left engine continued to sputter ominously. "We're not out of the woods yet," she said, voice low but commanding. The captain nodded, his eyes flicking to the storm outside. "We need to start planning an emergency descent," he said cautiously. Maya's mind raced. The city lights below twinkled faintly, distant and fragile. She plotted a descent path, calculating altitude, wind patterns, and engine performance. Every movement of the yoke, every throttle adjustment, had to be precise. She communicated with the co-pilot in clipped, urgent commands, aware that a single misstep could send the plane spiraling. A sudden warning siren pierced the cockpit. Flaps malfunction. Maya's stomach dropped. She immediately assessed the instruments, calculating alternative configurations. "We'll need to land faster than planned," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline hammering in her veins. The co-pilot's eyes widened, realizing the severity of the new complication. Back in the cabin, passengers shifted uneasily, unaware of the full extent of the crisis. A young mother clutched her child, whispering soothing words that rang hollow against the distant alarms and occasional tremors of the plane. A businessman muttered prayers under his breath, while a teenager stared wide-eyed at the overhead panel, phone in hand, recording. Fear had gripped everyone. The invisible tension of hundreds of lives waiting on a stranger's skill pressed down like a physical weight. Maya adjusted the plane's trajectory. Lightning illuminated the dark storm clouds outside, casting grotesque shadows inside the cockpit. She calculated the descent rate, balancing the failing hydraulics with engine thrust, all while monitoring altitude and speed. Every second was critical. Every adjustment was the difference between survival and catastrophe. "Brace for turbulence," she warned the co-pilot, as a sudden gust threw the plane violently to the right. Maya countered, fingers flying over the controls. The co-pilot gritted his teeth, following her precise movements. Outside, the storm swirled with an almost malevolent intensity, the lightning now closer, brighter, and more threatening. The captain spoke quietly but urgently. "We need to communicate with ATC and the emergency services on the ground. Prepare for potential landing complications." Maya nodded. "Do it. Keep them informed. But we focus here first. We stabilize, then we communicate. One step at a time." Her training kicked in fully now. Muscle memory, simulation exercises, and battlefield calm all converged. She was no longer just a passenger. She was the only person keeping hundreds alive. The co-pilot, pale and trembling, mirrored her every move, their coordination tenuous but effective. The plane responded slowly to their combined efforts, balancing on the razor's edge of disaster. Suddenly, the left engine sputtered violently again. Warning lights blinked faster. Maya's stomach tightened. Throttle up carefully. Compensate with the right engine. Monitor the left exhaust. Adjust flaps gradually. Her instructions were rapid, precise, and necessary. The plane trembled but remained under control. She allowed herself a fraction of relief, just enough to keep her focus intact. The storm continued its assault. Turbulence battered the fuselage. Lightning illuminated the clouds like jagged teeth. The co-pilot's hands were trembling violently now, but he continued to follow her instructions, eyes locked on the instruments. The captain monitored silently, a pillar of experience, offering calm guidance without interfering. Maya's mind was a battlefield of calculations and intuition, every decision carrying life-or-death weight. Back in the cabin, the passengers felt the changes instinctively. The violent rocking of the plane slowed marginally. Murmurs of hope mixed with continued fear. A young boy whispered, "Mommy, are we okay?" His mother squeezed him tightly, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "We will be. We just have to trust her." The weight of trust was monumental, invisible yet palpable, pressing into every nerve and muscle. Maya focused entirely on the instruments. The plane's descent path was stabilizing marginally, though the left engine still groaned and the flaps were partially unresponsive. She recalibrated the controls constantly, balancing speed, thrust, and hydraulic pressure. Outside, the storm showed no mercy. Lightning flashed again, illuminating their precarious flight path. The co-pilot let out a low breath. "She's doing it, she's keeping us flying." Maya didn't respond. Words were unnecessary. Every flick of her fingers, every adjustment was communication enough. The cockpit was a symphony of controlled chaos, each movement deliberate, each calculation precise. And then another warning siren blared, this one for landing gear hydraulics. Maya's stomach dropped further. The plane was still miles from the airport. They would need to execute emergency maneuvers on approach with partially failing systems. One misstep now could undo all their progress. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain calm. "We can do this," she muttered, mostly to herself. Her focus narrowed to the instruments, the yoke, the throttle. Every second mattered. Every passenger's life depended on her next move. The captain spoke quietly, a note of awe in his voice. "You're remarkable. I can't believe you're actually doing this." Maya didn't allow herself the luxury of acknowledgement. There was no time. The storm outside, the failing systems inside, and the hundreds of lives behind her demanded total attention. And in that suspended moment, Maya realized the terrifying truth. The plane was under control for now, but the storm, the failing engine, and the compromised landing gear meant that the real test, the emergency landing, was still ahead. Maya's hands were slick with sweat, gripping the yoke as the plane trembled violently. The storm outside was relentless, a swirling chaos of black clouds, lashing rain and blinding lightning. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit like a warning chorus, and the co-pilot's face was pale as he struggled to follow her rapid commands. Every second counted. Hesitation now could mean disaster. "Throttle up gently," she barked, correcting for the left engine's instability. The co-pilot's fingers trembled as he complied, but the plane's response was sluggish, as if testing their resolve. Outside, turbulence flung the aircraft violently, the fuselage creaking and groaning under the stress. Lightning split the sky, casting grotesque, strobe-like shadows across the cockpit. Maya's mind raced, calculating every possible adjustment. Flaps were partially unresponsive, hydraulics were fluctuating, and engine output was inconsistent. Every instinct she had learned in military jets kicked in, but this was different. Hundreds of lives were on the line, ordinary civilians completely unaware of the catastrophic balance just above them. She focused, filtering out fear, letting muscle memory guide her fingers. "Prepare for descent," the captain said quietly. "We need to reach the airport before the storm worsens." Maya nodded, eyes scanning the radar and instruments. "We'll descend slowly, maintain altitude stability, and correct every tilt immediately, step by step, no sudden moves." She glanced at the co-pilot. "You ready?" He swallowed hard, hands gripping the yoke. "As ready as I'll ever be." The descent began, deliberate and cautious. Maya adjusted throttle and rudder, managing the failing engine and carefully navigating through the storm cells. The plane shuddered violently with each gust of wind, and the co-pilot flinched with every turbulent spike. Maya barked instructions over the alarms and groaning metal. "Adjust flaps 5 degrees. Counter left tilt. Increase right engine thrust slightly. Steady, steady, steady." Passengers in the cabin clung to each other as the plane rocked. A mother held her child close, whispering calming words through trembling lips. The man in the aisle seat muttered under his breath, "We're going to make it. I think she's going to save us." Whispered prayers and silent gasps filled the cabin. Maya couldn't see them, but she could feel the weight of hundreds of lives pressing down on her shoulders. Lightning illuminated the cockpit again. Outside, the storm raged, a dark and threatening force. The left engine sputtered violently, warning lights blinking faster. Maya's stomach tightened, but she didn't hesitate. "Increase right engine thrust incrementally. Stabilize pitch. Watch hydraulic pressure. Keep altitude stable," she instructed, her voice crisp, cutting through the alarms. The co-pilot followed her instructions, shaking but precise. Another violent lurch threw both pilots against their harnesses. Maya's jaw clenched as she fought to maintain control. "Brace for turbulence," she shouted. The plane tilted dangerously, then corrected. They were alive by inches, by microseconds, by sheer focus. Each correction brought a little stability, each calculation a few precious seconds. "Emergency landing protocol," the captain said, calm but tense. "We need to prepare for possible aborted landing in case systems fail further." Maya's mind raced. "We'll need to approach the runway slowly, flaps half-responsive, hydraulic systems fluctuating, engine unstable. I need you on every adjustment and no sudden moves." She glanced at the radar. Runway lights were visible in the distance. glowing like faint beacons in the storm-dark night. Descending into the city, the lights of the airport cut through the rain like a fragile lifeline. Maya adjusted the descent angle, careful to account for wind shear, turbulence, and the left engine's instability. The co-pilot's fingers moved rapidly, following her commands, their coordination tenuous but working. Outside, lightning flashed again, illuminating a sky of swirling gray and black. A sudden warning blared, landing gear hydraulics malfunctioning. Maya's stomach dropped. The runway was close, but the gear might not deploy correctly. She pressed switches, tried alternative deployment methods, and kept the plane steady. Steady, 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 she repeated, her voice a mantra against chaos. The co-pilot mirrored her movements, hands shaking but precise. Passengers in the cabin gasped, unaware of the exact peril they faced. The violent shaking had slowed slightly, a fragile stability emerging. Mothers whispered prayers, couples held hands tightly, and a few recorded the moments on their phones, unable to fully grasp the gravity of what was unfolding. Maya glanced at the left engine gauge. Instability remained, but she had managed to compensate enough with right engine thrust and careful adjustments. Every jolt was a reminder of the fragility of the situation. Every calculation was life or death. Outside, storm clouds swirled violently, rain streaking the cockpit windows, making visibility almost zero. "Runway in sight," the captain said, voice calm but strained. Maya focused on the instruments, calculating approach speed, angle, and thrust. Flaps were partially functional, hydraulics unpredictable. She adjusted the yoke and throttle, feeling the plane respond sluggishly but sufficiently. The runway lights grew larger, a beacon in the storm, but the plane still lurched violently with each gust of wind. The co-pilot muttered, voice trembling. "We were going to make it, right?" Maya didn't answer. She couldn't afford hesitation. She focused entirely on control, every adjustment precise, every calculation perfect. The plane trembled as it descended, dangerously low, the engines groaning. The landing gear gauge flickered red. She pressed additional switches, praying the gear would hold. Another violent lurch rocked the plane. Maya's teeth clenched. "Stabilize, hold, steady." Outside, lightning split the stormy sky, illuminating the aircraft, the runway, the rain, the chaos. Every passenger's life was tethered to her hands, every breath held by her split-second decisions. The captain's voice cut through the alarms, calm but taut. "Prepare for possible aborted landing. Keep options open." Maya nodded, recalculating, adjusting. The runway grew closer. The plane's pitch and speed were balanced precariously. One miscalculation, one failed system, could send the aircraft spiraling. The co-pilot's hands were trembling violently now, but he followed her lead exactly. Maya adjusted throttle, yoke, rudder, flaps, hydraulic controls. Every instrument, every gauge, every lever mattered. The runway lights were now clearly visible. They were close, terrifyingly close. She glanced briefly at the altimeter, 10,000 feet, 8,000, 6,000. The storm continued its assault, rain slashing against the fuselage, lightning flickering around them. The engines groaned, the fuselage vibrated, and the plane lurched once again violently. Maya's pulse pounded in her ears, her hands a blur over the controls. "Prepare for final approach," she shouted. The co-pilot mirrored every adjustment. Outside, the runway was now within visual range. The storm, though still violent, seemed to bend around their precise maneuvers, as if the universe itself was testing her resolve. Passengers gripped seats, whispered prayers, and held loved ones tightly. The hum of tension filled the cabin like a living entity. Outside, the plane trembled violently one final time before stabilizing just enough for Maya to guide it toward the runway. She inhaled, preparing for the impossible. Touchdown with partially functioning hydraulics, an unstable engine, and a storm that showed no mercy. And in that suspended moment, hovering between hope and catastrophe, Maya realized that survival would depend entirely on the next few seconds. The runway lights glimmered through the torrential rain like a fragile promise. Maya's hands were locked firmly on the yoke. eyes darting between instruments and the storm-racked world outside the cockpit windows. The plane shuddered violently with each gust of wind, the engines groaning under the strain of the failing left engine. Every second felt stretched to an eternity, every calculation mattered. This was no longer about maintaining altitude, it was about survival. Altitude descending at 300 feet per minute, the co-pilot reported, voice trembling. Maya adjusted the throttles to compensate, feeling the plane respond sluggishly but obediently. The left engine sputtered again, a deep, ominous groan. "Keep it steady," she barked. "Don't overcompensate. One wrong move and we lose it all." The co-pilot nodded, eyes wide, gripping the yoke so tightly his knuckles were white. Rain lashed the cockpit windows, creating a chaotic blur of reflections and shadows. Lightning illuminated the plane, the runway, and the storm with split-second intensity. Maya's mind ran through emergency landing protocols, muscle memory guiding her fingers as she adjusted flaps, throttles, and rudders in a precise, deadly rhythm. She could feel every vibration, every jolt of the fuselage, and her heart raced with adrenaline. Passengers in the cabin gripped seats, whispered prayers, and held loved ones tighter. A mother murmured reassurances to her child she barely believed herself. A man muttered a quiet, desperate prayer under his breath. The teenager near the back of the plane had stopped recording, his wide eyes fixed on the seat in front of him. Fear had settled over the cabin like a living thing, yet beneath it was a fragile hope, hope tethered entirely to the woman in row 13. Maya's focus was absolute. Flaps were partially responsive, hydraulics fluctuating, and the left engine groaned ominously. She adjusted thrust, corrected pitch, and slowly descended toward the runway. Every movement had to be precise. The plane's trembling felt alive, testing her control, daring her to fail. She counted each second in her mind. 1, 2, 3, guiding the aircraft inch by inch toward survival. The captain's voice was calm but urgent. "Brace for turbulence on final approach. Adjust for wind shear." Maya nodded, eyes fixed ahead, hands moving rapidly over the yoke. She countered each gust, each violent jolt, making minuscule adjustments to keep the plane aligned with the runway. Her entire body ached with tension, but her mind remained razor-sharp, focused on the only thing that mattered, landing safely. The co-pilot's voice trembled. "We were aligned, I think we're aligned," he whispered. Maya allowed herself the smallest nod, focusing entirely on maintaining control. The runway grew larger, closer, and more real. The rain created a shimmering sheet over the asphalt, reflecting the flashing lights like a mirror. Visibility was poor. The plane responded sluggishly, but they were on the right path. "Throttle steady, flaps 45. Stabilize rudder," Maya instructed. She leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing. Every vibration of the fuselage, every groan of the engines, every flicker of the warning lights demanded her immediate attention. The plane shuddered violently again, pitching slightly to the left. She countered instantly, steadying the descent. Passengers murmured, whispered, and clutched one another as the plane wavered in the storm. The man in the aisle seat whispered, She's doing it, she's bringing us down." A young mother held her child tightly, whispering, "We're almost there, we're going to make it." Hope was fragile but growing, tethered entirely to Maya's skill. The left engine groaned again, sputtering under the strain. Warning lights blinked, and the co-pilot's fingers flew across controls as he followed Maya's precise instructions. She adjusted throttle, rudder, and yoke with precision, guiding the plane inch by inch toward the runway. The storm continued its assault, but they were close, so close. The first wheels touched the rain-slicked asphalt with a jolt that shook the cabin. Maya's hands tightened on the yoke, adjusting pitch and throttle to compensate for the failing hydraulics. The fuselage vibrated, groaning under the strain, but the plane remained level. Outside, the storm lashed violently, but the runway was now fully visible. Passengers gasped, some holding their breath. A mother whispered, "It's okay, honey. We're okay," as the plane skidded along the runway, water spraying in great sheets from the tires. Maya adjusted the throttles carefully, countering each tilt and keeping the aircraft aligned. The plane trembled violently as they passed the halfway mark, but she refused to panic, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. The co-pilot muttered, voice tight with relief, we're still stable." Maya didn't respond verbally. Her focus remained entirely on the instruments, the runway, and the next critical seconds. She guided the plane along the wet runway, countering every minor drift, every swerve caused by the storm and failing hydraulics. The plane groaned and shuddered as it neared the end of the runway. Flaps were only partially functional, engine power inconsistent, but Maya held the aircraft steady. Passengers clutched each other, whispered prayers, and gasped with every vibration. The plane's nose dipped, and she countered instantly, adjusting throttle and pitch to prevent a catastrophic nosedive. Lightning illuminated the stormy night one final time as the plane's nose wheels touched down. The fuselage vibrated violently, a testament to the rough landing, but the aircraft remained upright. Maya adjusted the throttles, using the right engine to counteract the unstable left engine and guide the plane to a safe stop. The rain was a relentless torrent, but the runway and survival were now within grasp. The plane skidded, tires hissing on the wet tarmac. Passengers held on, gasping, praying, some screaming in relief, some crying quietly. The co-pilot's face was pale but relieved, eyes wide as he followed Maya's instructions for braking. We're slowing," he shouted. Maya adjusted, maintaining control. The plane groaned, skidded, but finally came to a stop, engines straining as the storm continued to batter them. A stunned silence filled the cockpit. Then the captain exhaled deeply. "Maya, you did it. You actually did it." Maya's hands dropped slowly from the yoke, trembling, sweat streaming down her face. The plane shuddered one last time, groaning as it settled fully on the runway. Outside, rain pelted the fuselage, but the aircraft was stable, the passengers safe for now. Back in the cabin, passengers erupted in relief and quiet sobs. Mothers hugged children, couples embraced, and whispered prayers filled the air. The young boy near the back whispered, She saved us." The man in the aisle seat simply nodded, staring wide-eyed, overwhelmed by what had just occurred. The weight of fear lifted slightly, replaced by awe and gratitude. Maya allowed herself a moment to exhale, feeling the adrenaline finally ebb from her body. But she didn't relax completely. The storm was still raging, and though the landing was successful, the plane's systems were fragile, the engines unstable. They were safe for now, but the crisis wasn't fully over. And as the storm continued to lash outside, and emergency crews prepared for the aftermath, Maya realized the truth. The hardest moments were behind her, but the emotional toll, and the questions of how they all survived, were only just beginning. The plane finally came to a complete stop, the tires hissing on the rain-slicked tarmac. Emergency lights flashed, and a chorus of sirens approached from all directions. Fire trucks, ambulances, and airport rescue vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their red and blue lights cutting through the storm like a lifeline. Maya's hands were still trembling, sweat pouring down her face, but she remained alert, every muscle still taut with adrenaline. The storm had not relented, but for the first time, the passengers were physically safe. Passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts cautiously, some still clinging to loved ones, others shaking uncontrollably in relief. A mother whispered to her child, we're okay," her voice breaking with emotion. The man in the aisle seat who had earlier muttered, "She's doing it, she's saving us," now simply stared ahead, unable to process the enormity of what had just happened. The young boy from row 24 clutched his mother's hand, eyes wide with awe. Maya released a deep breath, leaning slightly forward over the yoke. The co-pilot was slumped in his seat, exhausted but alive, while the captain finally allowed himself a faint smile. "You've done something extraordinary," he said, his voice filled with quiet reverence. Maya didn't respond immediately. She had no words for what she had just accomplished. The storm, the emergency landing, the near-impossible series of maneuvers, they were all still vivid in her mind. Airport emergency crews began their coordinated approach. Rescue personnel climbed the steps of the mobile staircases, helping passengers disembark one by one. Passengers moved carefully, rain soaking them instantly, but their expressions were a mixture of relief, awe, and lingering fear. Some carried children in their arms, others supported elderly passengers, and all were united by one shared thought: they were alive because of her. Maya finally unbuckled herself and stood, legs weak from the stress. The captain placed a hand on her shoulder. "You need to step out now. Emergency crews are taking over." She nodded, stepping into the storm, rain pelting her face, hair plastered to her forehead. Rescue personnel guided her carefully down the stairs, shouting instructions over the howl of the wind. Every step reminded her of how fragile the situation had been and how quickly it could have ended in tragedy. Outside, the storm raged, but the lights of the airport and the approaching emergency crews created a surreal, almost cinematic scene. Maya felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. Passengers whispered her name, some crying, some laughing in relief. The young boy from the back of the plane ran forward, holding his mother's hand, eyes fixed on her. "Thank you," he whispered, voice trembling. Maya nodded silently, a lump forming in her throat. Emergency personnel guided the passengers toward buses and ambulances, while paramedics checked for injuries. Maya stayed nearby, watching the scene unfold. The man in the navy suit approached her cautiously. "I don't even know your name," he said, voice shaking. "But thank you, you saved us all." She nodded, refusing to speak. Words felt inadequate. Each life saved was a story of fear, faith, and survival, and she carried them all quietly in her mind. Meanwhile, airport authorities were beginning to take control. Officials cordoned off the runway, communicating with controllers and emergency crews. Fire trucks and ambulances were stationed strategically, prepared for any delayed complications. Maya observed, still tense, aware that the storm was not over and the plane's unstable systems could pose residual dangers. She knew she couldn't relax completely. Control had been maintained, but vigilance was still required. The captain finally spoke again, quiet but earnest. "We need to debrief you officially, and you'll need medical attention, but right now you did the impossible." Maya allowed herself a brief nod. The co-pilot, pale and exhausted, offered a weak smile. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. Maya shook her head. "You helped. We did it together." Their camaraderie was brief, forged in the intensity of crisis, but it carried weight beyond words. Back at the scene, passengers were being guided to temporary shelters to escape the pouring rain. The mother with her young boy stayed close to Maya as much as they could, thanking her repeatedly. A teenage girl with tear-streaked cheeks whispered, "You're a hero, a real hero." Maya looked down at her, voice barely audible over the storm. "We all survived. That's what matters." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had endured in the last hour. Emergency personnel began inspecting the plane, checking for structural damage and stabilizing the systems. The left engine had sustained stress beyond normal tolerances, the hydraulics had been compromised, and the flaps were partially stuck. Yet the aircraft had remained upright, on the runway, a testament to her skill and determination. Maya watched, hands clasped together, feeling the culmination of adrenaline and exhaustion crash over her. Meanwhile, media helicopters began arriving at a safe distance. News outlets, alerted by airport authorities, were reporting live on the emergency landing. They described the storm, the near disaster, and the fact that a passenger, a civilian, had taken control of the plane to save everyone aboard. Maya, still drenched from the rain, remained unnoticed in the chaos, yet the story was beginning to spread like wildfire. Her heroism was about to become headline news. The passengers were moved to sheltered areas, blankets handed out by emergency crews. Mothers cradled children, couples embraced, and strangers comforted one another. Everyone carried the memory of fear, adrenaline, and relief. Some still whispered Maya's name, some silently thanked her, and others simply stared into the storm, processing how close they had come to disaster. Maya finally allowed herself to lean against the side of the emergency vehicle, breathing deeply. Her hands shook, her muscles ached, and her mind replayed every terrifying second of the flight. Yet amid the exhaustion, a profound sense of responsibility and accomplishment settled over her. She had acted when no one else could, faced the impossible, and brought everyone down safely. As the storm began to subside slightly, airport authorities gathered Maya, the captain, and the co-pilot for a preliminary debrief. Officials spoke quickly, asking for details of the emergency, the sequence of failures, and the maneuvers executed. Maya recounted with clarity, precision, and humility. The officials listened intently, realizing that what had just occurred was not a routine emergency. It was a miracle of skill, nerve, and courage under pressure. Suddenly, one of the emergency crew approached, holding a phone. "You need to see this," he said. On the screen, a video from a passenger was playing, the exact moment Maya had taken control of the plane. The footage showed her determination, hands moving rapidly over the yoke and the plane stabilizing in the storm. Gasps echoed as officials watched, realizing the enormity of her actions. The captain placed a hand on Maya's shoulder, voice low. "They're going to call you a hero, and you are, but you need to rest now. You've earned it." Maya nodded silently, allowing herself a brief moment of recognition. She had saved hundreds of lives, yet she felt the weight of their fear, their prayers, and their trust pressing down on her. And then, from a distance, a reporter's voice carried across the tarmac. "Do we have the passenger who saved the flight?" Hundreds of eyes turned in her direction. Maya remained still, drenched and exhausted, unsure how to respond. The storm had not just tested her skill, it had tested her courage, her endurance, and her willingness to step forward when no one else could. And in that moment she realized that while the plane was safe, the true storm, the storm of attention, questions, and the world's gaze, was only just beginning. The storm had finally passed, leaving the airport bathed in the pale glow of early morning. Maya stood at the edge of the tarmac, still damp from the relentless rain, her uniform plastered to her skin. Around her, emergency crews were finishing up inspections. Passengers huddled in blankets, and reporters had begun to gather at a cautious distance, their cameras focused and microphones poised. She could feel every eye on her, the weight of hundreds of lives, the scrutiny of the world, and the quiet, unspoken admiration of those she had saved. The first official debrief had concluded. Airport authorities had confirmed what she already knew. The left engine had sustained critical damage, the flaps were partially inoperable, and the hydraulic system had been compromised. Without her quick thinking and decisive actions, the plane would not have touched down safely. She had defied odds, skillfully navigating through a storm of mechanical failure and natural fury. Yet as the adrenaline receded, exhaustion and disbelief settled in, leaving her feeling hollow, almost weightless. Passengers began filing past, offering quiet words of thanks. Some were tearful, some simply nodded, eyes wide with gratitude. The young boy from row 24 approached first, clutching his mother's hand tightly. You saved us," he whispered, voice trembling. Maya bent slightly, attempting a reassuring smile. "We all made it," she said softly. "That's what matters." The mother held her son close, tears streaming down her face. The boy whispered almost to himself, "You're a hero." The captain approached, his expression a mixture of pride and awe. "Maya, I've seen a lot in my career," he said, voice low, "but what you just did, it's extraordinary. You didn't just save lives, you gave them hope in the middle of chaos. I don't know how to thank you." Maya shook her head, exhausted. "I just did what had to be done." The co-pilot, still pale and trembling, added, "We wouldn't have survived without you." She glanced at him, acknowledging his courage as well, knowing the chaos they had endured together. But the calm was fleeting. A chorus of reporters began shouting questions, cameras rolling, lights flashing. "Miss, were you really a passenger? How did you know how to fly the plane? Do you consider yourself a hero?" Maya's stomach tightened. She had expected recognition, but the sudden spotlight was overwhelming. Hundreds of lives were saved, yet now the weight of public attention pressed down on her in a new and unfamiliar way. An airport official guided her toward a quieter area, away from the press. "We need statements, official reports," he said briskly. Maya nodded, hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of landing. She was led into a temporary command tent, where officials were reviewing flight data, cockpit recordings, and emergency communications. Every monitor, every display confirmed what she already knew. Her actions had been flawless, yet now they were being dissected for scrutiny, analysis, and public consumption. Inside the tent, a senior investigator spoke carefully. "You acted decisively, without hesitation, and saved everyone on board. Protocol requires we document everything, but your actions were outside the norm. Civilian passengers are not trained to take control of a commercial aircraft. There will be questions, but for now, know that lives were saved because of you." Maya nodded, absorbing both the praise and the implied scrutiny. Heroism often came with consequences she hadn't yet considered. Meanwhile, outside, passengers began sharing their experiences. Social media erupted with video clips, personal accounts, and live commentary. Hashtags praising her courage spread rapidly. News outlets reported the miraculous emergency landing, describing a passenger who had stepped in when trained pilots were struggling. Maya could hear fragments of conversations from the tent. Row 13 passenger, emergency control, saved hundreds. The world was already framing her as a hero. As she processed the chaos, she noticed a young mother crying softly nearby, holding her child tightly. "You were amazing," she whispered to Maya. "We were terrified, and then you came. You saved us." Maya felt a lump in her throat, finally allowing herself to absorb the emotional magnitude of what had happened. Hundreds of strangers had trusted her instinct and skill, and she had delivered. Relief, exhaustion, and pride mingled within her, a powerful and disorienting cocktail. Yet beneath the public recognition and emotional relief, a subtle tension remained. Authorities had to determine how she managed to take control, how the airline would respond, and whether her actions, though heroic, could set a precedent in civil aviation. Maya understood this. Heroism was not free from consequences. She might face interviews, investigations, or even legal scrutiny. For now, though, she allowed herself a brief respite, breathing deeply, standing in the damp tarmac, feeling the storm fade behind her. A news helicopter hovered nearby, capturing the scene. Reporters shouted questions again, this time with more urgency. "Can we interview you? Do you feel responsible for saving all these people?" Maya finally stepped forward, voice steady despite the exhaustion. "I was a passenger. I did what I had to do to keep everyone safe. That's all." Her simplicity resonated, and for a moment, the chaos of cameras, microphones, and flashing lights seemed to fade. The co-pilot approached quietly, still shaken but smiling. "I'll never forget this," he said softly. "None of us will. You took control when no one else could, and we all owe you our lives." Maya shook her head. "We all survived because of focus, teamwork, and trust. I wasn't alone." She glanced toward the captain, who gave a small nod of agreement. Their shared understanding of the crisis, forged in a storm, spoke louder than any media praise could. Airport officials, recognizing both her heroism and the potential media frenzy, moved to manage the crowd. Emergency personnel escorted remaining passengers to safe areas, and reporters continued broadcasting live updates. Social media was alight with awe, disbelief, and admiration. Videos of Maya's decisive actions circulated widely, framing her as a symbol of courage, skill, and calm under pressure. Even as the world began to acknowledge her bravery, Maya felt a profound quiet inside. She had saved hundreds of lives, faced unimaginable danger, and navigated a near-impossible storm. Yet the experience had left a mark, an indelible imprint of fear, tension, and responsibility. Heroism, she realized, was not just action. It was endurance, courage under pressure, and the willingness to act when all odds seemed insurmountable. Finally, the storm fully subsided. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the first hints of sunlight broke through the clouds. Maya took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past hours slowly begin to lift. Around her, passengers began to laugh, cry, and embrace one another, processing the emotional intensity of survival. Airport personnel continued their assessments, and officials prepared to address the media formally. Maya looked out across the runway, still wet and glistening from the storm. She thought of the moments inside the cockpit, the rapid calculations, the terrifying instability, and the sheer trust passengers had placed in her. For all the attention and recognition that would come, she understood something profound. Heroism was not about accolades. It was about action, courage, and the lives you preserve when no one else can. As emergency crews began final procedures, Maya allowed herself to finally relax, if only slightly. Cameras, reporters, and officials were still present, yet she stood tall, drenched but resolute, embodying quiet strength. The passengers scattered around the tarmac occasionally turned to her, offering nods, waves, or whispered thanks. Each gesture reaffirmed what she already knew. Hundreds of lives had been saved, and the impossible had been accomplished. The media would call her a hero. Authorities would review every detail. Passengers would share their stories for years. Yet for Maya, the most important truth was simple. She had acted when no one else could, and hundreds of lives had been preserved because of it. The storm had ended, but its memory, and the courage it demanded, would remain forever. And as the sun began to rise, casting golden light over the wet tarmac, Maya allowed herself the smallest, quietest smile. Against the fury of nature, against the failure of machinery, against fear and uncertainty, she had prevailed. She had flown not just a plane, but hope itself into a new dawn. The world had watched. The passengers were safe. And a woman who had been asleep in row 13 had become something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The end.